A woman standing on a wooden platform in the blazing sun, wrists bound, while men below traded coins for the right to own her. Not her labor, not her time. Her. In a town that called itself civilized, Eliza Hart was auctioned off like a broken mule no one wanted, but everyone thought they could use. And the man who changed everything that day wasn't a lawman, wasn't a preacher, wasn't anyone who should have cared. He was the most dangerous man in the territory. And he was watching from the shadows with something cold shifting behind his eyes. If you want to know what happened next, stay with me until the end. Hit that like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction began at noon. Not that anyone called it that, not out loud anyway. The posted notice outside Hannigan's general store used the word arrangement, which was the kind of language men in Dustridge reached for when they wanted something ugly to sound like paperwork. The notice said that one Eliza May Hart, daughter of the late Clarence Hart, having defaulted on a debt of $412 owed to the Dustridge Land and Commerce Trust, would be made available for labor indenture to the highest bidder, effective the 14th of August, 1883. Labor indenture. The crowd that gathered in the square that afternoon numbered somewhere near 60 people. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because they had nothing better to do on a hot Tuesday. And some came because they'd heard the Hart girl was presentable, which was the kind of thing men said in Dustridge when they meant something they wouldn't repeat in front of their wives. Eliza stood on the platform they'd built out of old fence boards and wagon planks, and she kept her eyes forward and her jaw set, because the moment she looked at anyone directly, she knew she would come apart, and she could not afford to come apart. Not here, not in front of them. She was 24 years old. She had her mother's dark hair, which she wore pinned back tight, and her father's stubbornness, which she wore the same way. Her dress was the best one she owned, a faded gray wool with a collar she'd repaired twice. And she had put it on that morning with hands that shook so badly she'd had to sit on the edge of the bed and breathe for a full minute before she could manage the buttons. Her wrists weren't bound. That was the one small mercy. They'd told her if she cooperated, there would be no restraints. So she stood with her hands clasped in front of her, fingers laced together tightly enough that the knuckles had gone white. The man running the proceeding was a lawyer named Doyle Pruitt, who worked for the Land and Commerce Trust, and who had the kind of face that always looked vaguely disappointed in whoever he was looking at. He stood to the left of the platform with a ledger open in one hand and a handkerchief in the other, dabbing at the sweat on his forehead with methodical regularity. "We are here," Pruitt announced to the assembled crowd, "to satisfy a legally established debt under the terms of the Dustridge Labor Provision Act, which was duly passed by the Town Council on the 3rd of March of this year and signed into effect by Mayor Aldous Greer." Someone near the back of the crowd muttered something. Pruitt ignored it. "The indenture will run for a period not to exceed 3 years, during which time the contracted party will provide labor and service to the winning bidder," said bidder assuming responsibility for housing, sustenance, and any outstanding debts at the time of transfer. Eliza stared at a fixed point above the heads of the crowd, a weather vane on top of the mercantile across the square, shaped like a rooster, spinning slow in the dead August heat. She focused on that rooster and kept her breathing even. 3 years. They were talking about 3 years of her life like it was a line item in a ledger. "Bidding will commence at $50, Pruitt said. The first bid came from a rancher named Tully Mast, who raised 2 fingers from the brim of his hat without bothering to take it off. $50. He said it the way you'd say it at a livestock sale. Bored, certain he'd go higher if he had to, just establishing the floor. $50, Pruitt said. "Do I hear 60? A heavy-set man near the front, Eliza recognized him as Harlan Beach, who ran the feedlot south of town, raised his hand. 60. 60. Do I hear 70? It went on like that for a few minutes, the numbers climbing in slow increments, and the crowd watching with the kind of half-interested attention people gave to things that were strange, but not strange enough to make them leave. A few men made jokes to the people standing next to them. A woman near the back turned her face away. A boy of maybe 12 stood on the top rail of the fence by the livery and watched with his mouth open. At $120, the bidding slowed. Tully Mass was still in. So was a man Eliza didn't recognize. Tall, raw-boned, with a sun-weathered face and hands that looked like they'd been doing hard work since before he could walk. He was bidding in the flat, toneless way of someone who'd already decided what he was willing to pay and was just waiting for the other man to quit. Eliza felt a bead of sweat trace down her spine beneath her dress. The sun was sitting directly overhead, and the platform had no shade and there was no wind at all. The air in the square smelled like horse and dust, and the faint sweetness of something rotting a few streets over. She thought about her father. Clarence Hart had not been a particularly good man, but he had not been a cruel one either. He had been stubborn and bad with money, and prone to making handshake deals with people who later produced paperwork that said something different from what had been agreed on. He had died in April of a chest illness that had gone from a cough to a grave in less than 6 weeks, and he had left Eliza with a house that wasn't paid for, a mule with a broken leg that had to be put down, and a debt to the Land and Commerce Trust that she had not known existed until a man named Pruitt showed up at her door with a letter. She had tried to work it off. She'd taken in laundry, done mending, sold the furniture piece by piece. She'd gone to see Mayor Greer and asked for more time. Greer had given her a look of such practiced sympathy that she'd known immediately the decision had already been made. The debt was $412. In 3 months of working herself hollow, she'd paid down $40. $140, Tullymass said. $150, said the raw-boned man. Pruitt wiped his forehead again. $150. Do I hear $160? Tullymass tilted his head, looked at Eliza with the evaluating squint of a man deciding whether a horse was worth the asking price, then shook his head and stepped back. Done. $150 going once, Pruitt said. Going twice. $450. The voice came from the left side of the square, near the gap between the harness shop and the old assay office. It was not a loud voice. It didn't need to be. The kind of quiet that fell over that crowd in the 2 seconds after those words landed was the kind that starts in the chest before it reaches the ears. The instinctive animal silence of people who have just recognized something they do not want to be near. Eliza turned her head. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, just outside the loose ring of onlookers, in a patch of shadow thrown by the overhang of the harness shop, tall enough that the shadow only covered him to the shoulder. He had a dark gray hat pulled low, and a duster that had once been brown and was now the color of old wood. A gun on his right hip, plain holster, no ornamentation. He was looking at Pruitt the way you look at something that is taking up space in a doorway. Eliza didn't know his name yet, but she could read the crowd's reaction like a temperature drop. Heads turning, bodies shifting, a few people stepping back half a step without deciding to. Pruitt stared at him. Pardon? $450, the man said again, same tone, same volume. Cash. Pruitt's mouth opened and closed once. He looked down at his ledger, then back up. Sir, I'll need to confirm you're a registered citizen of... I'm registered, the man said. Cade Mercer. You've got my name in that book. 3rd page, left column. I had a property dispute with the trust 2 years back. Pruitt flipped to the 3rd page with hands that weren't entirely steady. He found the name. He looked up at the man again with an expression that had moved well past professional neutrality into something closer to personal discomfort. The raw-boned man who'd been the high bidder turned around to look at Mercer, got a clear view of his face, and walked away without a word. $450, Pruitt said finally, his voice coming out thinner than he'd intended. Is there a counterbid? 60 people stood in the square and said nothing. Going once, going twice. He paused for a very long moment in the way of a man hoping something will happen to save him from where this is going. Nothing happened. Sold. Eliza did not move from the platform immediately. She stood there for a moment while Pruitt descended and crossed the square toward Mercer, clutching his ledger against his chest like a shield. She watched Mercer reach into the inside pocket of his duster and produce a folded envelope, which he handed to Pruitt without ceremony. Pruitt counted it, which took a while, and during the counting the crowd began to disperse, not all at once, but in the way of people who have decided they'd rather not be present for whatever came next. She climbed down from the platform herself, without help, because there was no one offering any. Her legs felt wrong. Not weak exactly, just strange, like they'd forgotten for a moment what they were for. She walked across the square toward Pruitt and the man who had just bought her, and with every step she kept her spine straight and her face still, because the alternative was something she refused to allow herself. Pruitt handed her a folded copy of the indenture contract when she reached him, a single sheet of paper, dense with language designed to be difficult to argue with, and said, without meeting her eyes, "You'll want to keep that." Then he left. He walked back toward his office with the quick, purposeful stride of a man putting distance between himself and something he didn't want to be responsible for, which left Eliza standing 6 feet from Cade Mercer. Up close, he was older than she'd initially thought, somewhere in his late 30s, with a face that had been worked over by weather and had clearly also been worked over by at least one person's fist at some point, given the way his nose sat slightly off-center. He had dark eyes, the kind that were easy to mistake for emotionless until you looked at them long enough to realize they were just controlled. He was looking at her now, not the way Tully Mast had looked at her from the crowd, assessing, but more the way someone looks at a situation they've put themselves in the middle of and are now working out the particulars of. "Eliza Hart," he said. "Yes." "You know who I am?" She did, by now. The name had moved through the crowd in a low current after he'd spoken. Mercer. It's Mercer. And she'd caught enough fragments to piece together the shape of it. Fastest gun in the territory. Killed 4 men in Laredo. Worked as an enforcer for the railroad before the railroad decided he was more trouble than he was worth. Don't look at him too long. The specific details varied depending on who was whispering, but the general outline was consistent. "I've heard the name," she said. "Then you understand my reputation." "I understand people talk." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. Not quite a reaction, more like the start of one that he reconsidered. "Fair enough," he said. "I've got a horse around the side of the harness shop. We're going to ride out of town now before Pruitt thinks of something clever to do." "And where are we riding to?" "My camp, about 4 hours east." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm not going to hurt you." Men who aren't going to hurt women don't usually have to say so in the opening conversation. This time something moved across his face that might, in another man, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't complete itself. "That's a reasonable point," he said. "I don't have a better answer for it right now. But you just got sold on a platform to any man who had the coin, and the alternative to coming with me is going back to whatever you came from." Eliza looked at the square around her. The emptied space, the fence-board platform still standing in the August sun, the weather-vane rooster on the mercantile roof turning in a small gust that had arrived too late to mean anything. She thought about the house with no furniture, the mule she'd had to put down, the $40 she'd scraped together over 3 months that hadn't been enough. She folded the indenture contract and put it in the pocket of her dress. "Fine," she said. "Let's go." Check. The horse was a big roan gelding with a white stripe down his nose and the ground-eating stride of an animal that had been ridden hard for years and had made a kind of peace with it. Mercer's saddlebags were packed tight, and his bedroll was tied behind the cantle with the particular efficiency of someone who'd been living out of those bags for a long time. He gave her the saddle and rode behind her, which she hadn't expected, and which created an awkward geometry that neither of them acknowledged for the first hour. They rode east out of Dust Ridge on the main road and then cut south onto a wagon track that narrowed to a trail and then to something less than a trail, just a suggestion in the grass where someone had passed before. The land opened up around them, broken scrub country, red dirt, stands of juniper and pinyon, the occasional hulking rock formation rising out of the flats like something that had decided to stay when everything else moved on. Eliza didn't try to make conversation. She had too many things turning over in her head and no clear way to sort them yet. She watched the terrain and tried to think practically, which was what she defaulted to when she was scared. What did she know? She knew she was indentured to this man for 3 years by a legal document that the town of Dust Ridge had apparently seen fit to create specifically to make things like this possible. She knew he'd paid significantly more than the debt she actually owed, which raised a question she hadn't asked yet. She knew his name meant something to people, and that what it meant was dangerous. What she didn't know was why. Around the 2-hour mark, the trail dropped into a dry creek bed that ran between 2 low ridges, offering shade on the east-facing wall. Mercer pulled up and dismounted without a word, and Eliza climbed down from the saddle without waiting for help. Her legs ached from the unaccustomed riding position, and there was a blister forming on her left heel from the walking she'd done that morning. She sat on a flat-topped rock while Mercer watered the horse from a canteen he'd emptied into his upturned hat, a practiced, careful operation that suggested he'd done it 1,000 times. The horse drank steadily. A hawk passed overhead, very high, going somewhere with specific intent. "You paid $450, Eliza said. Mercer didn't look up from the horse. "I did." "My debt was $412. "Yes." "So you're out $38 above what the debt required." "The extra was to make sure nobody else was inclined to argue the bid," he said. "Psychological margin." She looked at him. "That's a strange thing for a man to spend money on." "I've spent it on stranger." She waited, but he didn't elaborate. The horse finished drinking and Mercer put his hat back on, settling it with 2 fingers at the brim in the particular way of someone for whom that gesture was as automatic as breathing. "Why?" Eliza asked. He looked at her then, directly, in a way he hadn't been doing, the controlled eyes finding her face and staying there. "Because what they did to you today was illegal. The town council passed a law. That doesn't make it legal. There's a difference." He pulled out a strip of dried beef from his saddlebag, broke it in half, and held out one piece toward her without any particular ceremony. She took it. "The Labor Provision Act they cited doesn't exist in any territorial statute I can find. Pruitt drafted it himself on behalf of the trust. Mayor Greer signed it because Greer does what the trust tells him to." Eliza chewed the dried beef, which was tough and heavily salted and tasted more or less like a shoe, and thought about what he'd just said. "You researched this." "I've been researching the trust for about 8 months. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is deciding how much to say rather than whether to say anything. "Because they took land that belonged to people who couldn't fight back to take it. 3 families I know of. Probably more I don't." He looked at the creek bed, then back at her. "I had a place once. Nothing much. 30 acres of bad grazing land and a cabin that let in the cold. The trust came after it 2 years back. I had the money and the capacity to argue, so they backed off." He said it flat, without inflection, but something underneath it wasn't flat at all. "Most people don't have either of those things." Eliza turned that over. A man who'd gone through his own version of what the trust did, who hadn't forgotten it, who had come to an auction in a town square and spent $450, which was a great deal of money for a man who lived out of saddlebags, because he decided to do something about it. It was either principled or deranged, and she couldn't yet determine which. "What exactly is your plan?" she asked. "I've got evidence," he said. "Documents. Testimony from one of the settlers who had his land taken, a man named Amos Fitch, lives about 60 miles north of here. There's a territorial judge out of Santa Caldera who isn't in the trust's pocket. If I can get enough of it together and get it in front of him, the whole structure comes down." "And you need me for what?" He looked at her again. "I needed you out of that square," he said, which wasn't an answer, and both of them knew it. They rode on. The camp was in a place that probably had a name on some surveyor's map, but didn't have one in common use. A wide shelf of rock about 40 feet above a dry river canyon, accessible only by a narrow switchback trail that a horse could manage, but that 2 riders would find nerve-testing. There was a lean-to built against a rock face, packed with gear. A fire ring of stacked stones, cold and ash-gray. A view to the west that in the dying afternoon light turned the whole broken landscape into something that looked almost worth living in. Eliza helped with the horse, unsaddling, rubbing him down, staking him on a long line where the grass was decent. And Mercer didn't tell her to stop or try to take over, which she appreciated. She was capable of useful work, and being treated otherwise made her irritable. He started the fire while she set out the things she'd found in the saddlebags that constituted, apparently, the food supply. Dried beans, a small bag of cornmeal, some kind of cured pork wrapped in cloth, and 3 very tired-looking onions. "Is there a cook pot?" she asked. He pointed at the lean-to. She found a battered iron pot, a skillet, a tin cup that had been repaired with a piece of wire. She set the beans to soak in what water they had left and cut up the pork and onions into the skillet, working efficiently, keeping her movement small and purposeful. The sun went down fast, the way it did out in the open country, and the sky went through 3 or 4 different shades of orange and red before settling into a purple dark full of stars. The fire threw a small circle of light. Beyond it, the canyon dropped away into a dark that made the world feel bigger than it had any business being. They ate in the kind of quiet that isn't entirely comfortable but isn't hostile either. The food was basic and it was enough. A coyote called somewhere down in the canyon and another one answered it from further off, the two of them conducting some transaction Eliza couldn't interpret. After a while, Mercer said, "I was at the auction before they started it." She looked at him across the fire. "I know. I saw you." A small pause. "I wasn't sure you had. You were watching from the shadow by the harness shop. I saw you maybe 10 minutes before Pruitt started talking." He nodded slowly, not at anything in particular, just confirming something to himself. "I'd been in town 3 days, trying to figure out whether the auction was real or whether Pruitt was bluffing." His jaw moved. "He wasn't bluffing." "No," she said. "He wasn't." The fire popped. An ember jumped and died in the dirt. "How bad was it?" he said. It wasn't quite a question, the way he said it. More like an acknowledgement that he already knew the shape of the answer and was giving her the option to say it if she wanted to. Eliza thought about the platform, the sun, the crowd standing below her while Pruitt read from his ledger in that flat, bureaucratic voice, as though what he was describing was ordinary, as though it was paperwork. The way Tully Mast had looked at her, the boy on the fence rail with his mouth open. "I kept my eyes on the weather vane," she said. Mercer looked at her without speaking. "The one on the mercantile. The rooster. I decided before it started that I was going to keep my eyes on that and not on anyone in the crowd. Because if I looked at anyone in the crowd, I was going to—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter." "It does," he said. She shook her head. "What matters is what I do from here." He considered that. Then he reached into the pocket of his duster and pulled out a folded oilcloth envelope, thicker than the one he'd handed Pruitt, bulging slightly with what was inside it. He set it on the rock between them. "Those are the documents I mentioned," he said. "Forged land contracts. 2 sets of deeds for the same parcels, the original ones which the trust got from the settlers through fraudulent appraisals and fake debt notices, and the doctored ones they filed with the Territorial Records Office. Survey maps with altered boundaries, a ledger page from the trust's internal accounts showing payments made to Greer and 2 of the council members." Eliza put down her tin cup and picked up the envelope. She unwrapped it carefully and looked at the top document. A land deed for 40 acres, name of original owner printed at the top, Amos Fitch. Below it, a second deed for the same 40 acres with a different date, different notary signature, and a description that differed from the first in 3 key ways she could identify without knowing the land. "The second deed is forged," she said. "Yes." The notary seal is slightly off-center, and the ink on the date is a different shade from the rest of the document. He looked at her with a different quality of attention than he'd been using. "You can see that?" "My father was a surveyor, briefly, before he was other things." She looked at the next document. Another deed, different names, same pattern. "He taught me to read land documents, said there was good money in spotting bad ones if you worked for the right people." She paused. "He never actually worked for the right people. Do you know enough to write an affidavit explaining what these documents show? In language that would hold up in a territorial court?" She looked at him. "Probably, depending on what we're working with." "I've got 17 documents," he said. "Deeds, contracts, 2 ledger pages, and a letter from Greer to the trust's senior partner that is explicit." Eliza set the deed down carefully and looked across the fire at Cade Mercer. He was watching her with those controlled eyes, and she had the sense, for the first time, that he had been planning something that required more than one person, and that whatever plan he'd had before tonight had just changed shape when she told him she could read land documents. "I'm not going to run," she said, "before you ask. Or don't ask. I'm telling you, I'm not going to take the first opportunity to disappear into the territory, and I'm not going to sit quiet somewhere while you do whatever you're doing alone. She picked the envelope back up. But I need to understand all of it. Everything you know. Every piece of it. Not a summary. All of it. Because if I'm going to help you take something apart, I need to know how it was built. The fire shifted. A log settled. The coyote in the canyon called again, further away now, moving on. Cade Mercer looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something that has surprised him, and he hadn't expected to be surprised. "All right," he said. He reached into the lean-to and brought out a second oilcloth parcel, and then a third, and then a small journal with a cracked leather cover, and he set them on the rock between them, and Eliza Hart pulled them toward her and began to read. The fire burned low and neither of them moved to add wood, and the stars over the canyon were very bright and very indifferent, the way stars tend to be, and the documents spread out on the rock between them in the firelight told the story of everything the Land and Commerce Trust had built, and everything it had stolen, and what it would take to prove it. She read until her eyes ached. She asked questions when she didn't understand something, and he answered them without condescension and without rushing her. She found 2 documents she thought could be argued against in court, and she said so, and he nodded and made a note in the cracked leather journal. Around midnight she stopped, not because she was done, she wasn't done, but because her mind had reached the point where it was holding things without processing them, which was worse than not reading at all. "We'll continue tomorrow," she said. "Yes." She looked around the camp, suddenly practical. "Where do I sleep?" He pointed at the lean-to. "Take the bedroll. I'll use the saddle blanket." "That's not—" "I've slept on worse than a saddle blanket," he said, without a trace of martyrdom. "Just a fact." She took the bedroll. She lay down on the hard rock shelf of the lean-to, wrapped in canvas that smelled like horse and wood smoke, and looked up at the rock face above her, and she thought, "I am indentured to a man I met 4 hours ago, sleeping on a rock shelf above a canyon somewhere east of the town that sold me, with 17 pieces of evidence that could put powerful men in prison spread out on a rock by a dying fire." She thought, $40 in 3 months wasn't going to be enough. It was never going to be enough. They were always going to find a way. She thought, that rooster weather vane. I looked at it and I did not come apart. She closed her eyes. Sleep came slower than she expected and faster than she'd earned, the way it does when the body has been through enough that it stops asking permission. Outside, the fire went to coals. The stars turned overhead in their slow, indifferent arc. Cade Mercer sat against the rock near the fire ring with the cracked leather journal open on his knee and a stub of pencil in his hand, writing in the dark with the careful economy of a man who had learned not to waste what he had. And the canyon below them held its dark and its silence and the distant sound of something that might have been water or might have been the wind moving through a very narrow place. The 14th of August, 1883, ended. Whatever was coming would start in the morning. She woke before the sun was fully up, in that gray, uncertain hour when the light hasn't committed to anything yet, and the world looks like it's still deciding whether to go through with the day. The rock beneath her was unforgiving in a way she hadn't fully registered the night before. Her hip ached, her shoulder ached, and there was a crick in her neck that she worked at with her fingers while she sat up and tried to remember where she was. The fire was dead. Mercer was not where she'd last seen him. She stood, folded the canvas bedroll with the automatic tidiness of someone who'd grown up in a house where mess had consequences, and stepped out of the lean-to. The canyon below was still in shadow, the far wall catching the first pale light at its top edge. The horse was on his line, awake, ears moving in that slow, independent way horses use to track a world they can hear better than you can. Mercer came up the switchback trail with his hat pushed back and a canvas bag over one shoulder, moving with the slightly deliberate care of a man negotiating uneven ground while carrying something that could spill. He looked up and saw her standing there and said, "There's a seep spring about a quarter-mile down. I filled the canteens." "Good morning to you too," she said. He stopped at the fire ring and set the bag down. "Didn't take you for someone who needed the formalities." "I don't need them. I just note their absence." He looked at her for a half-second, then started rebuilding the fire. She watched him work. He was efficient with it, no wasted motion, kindling placed with a precision that suggested he'd built this particular fire in this particular ring many times. And she thought about what she'd read the night before, the documents spread on the rock, the names and dates and numbers that added up to something systematic and deliberate, not the ordinary frontier greed of men helping themselves to what they could reach, but something more constructed than that. Something with paperwork. The beans from the night before were still in the pot. She set them over the fire when it caught. "Amos Fitch," she said. "The man in the documents. You said he's 60 miles north." "About that." "And he'll testify." Mercer sat back on his heels. "He said he would, back in March when I first talked to him. Whether he still will is a different question." He looked at the fire. "He's got a wife and 2 kids on that land. The trust didn't get it from him completely. They got 20 acres of the 40 and the water rights, which means they control whether his cattle drink. That kind of pressure changes people's calculations." "What's the territorial judge's name, the one in Santa Caldera?" "Harlan Cross. He's been on the bench 11 years. Turned down 2 appointments to bigger courts, which either means he's principled or he's lazy. And from what I found, it's mostly the former." "You've met him?" "Once, briefly. I got in front of him on a property matter 3 years back, unrelated to this. He's the kind of judge who reads what you put in front of him, actually reads it." Eliza stirred the beans. They were edible, barely. "There's a problem with the deeds," she said. "The 2 I flagged last night. The forged signatures on the Calloway parcel and the notary issue on the Whitmore deed. Those 2 documents are weak. If the trust has a good lawyer, and they will, those get challenged first, and if they fall apart in testimony, it poisons the rest of the set in the jury's mind." Mercer was looking at her with that particular quality of attention again, the one she'd noticed the night before. Focused, assessing, not unkind. "What would you need to shore them up?" "The original survey plat for the Calloway parcel, if it still exists anywhere. And a second witness who can speak to the Whitmore notarization, someone who was present or who can testify to the notary's regular practice. The Calloway survey plat would be in the Territorial Land Office, which is in Mill Haven, about 22 miles southwest of Dust Ridge." Eliza considered this. "So we'd be riding back into roughly the territory we just left. More or less." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that riding anywhere near Dust Ridge within 48 hours of the auction felt like walking into a room you'd just been thrown out of. Instead, she said, "What about the Whitmore notary?" "Dead. Died in December." He paused. "His wife is still in Dust Ridge, though, Clara Whitmore. She worked alongside him for years, handled the clerical side of the business. She'd know his practice." "Would she talk to us?" "She might talk to you," he said. "She's not going to open her door to me." Eliza absorbed that. "Why not?" He reached into the inside pocket of his duster and pulled out a folded paper. Not from the evidence bundle. This one was different, more worn along the creases, like it had been opened and refolded many times. He held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was a wanted notice, printed on cheap paper in the blocky type of a territorial marshal's office. The name at the top was Cade Mercer. The charges listed were assault, destruction of property, and interfering with lawful commerce, which was a phrase she'd never seen on a wanted notice before. There was a sketch in the center, not a terrible likeness, she thought, looking from it to the man, and a reward amount, $200. "When?" she asked. "6 months ago. The assault charge is from an altercation in a town called Red Rock, which is about 40 miles east of Dust Ridge, and which is also, not coincidentally, a town where the trust has significant land holdings. The commerce charge is their invention." His voice stayed even. "I broke a man's jaw in Red Rock. That part is accurate. He had a settler family at gunpoint trying to get them to sign over their deed at 2 in the morning. She refolded the notice and handed it back to him. "So you're wanted," she said, "in 3 counties. And you walked into Dust Ridge's town square and bid at a public auction." "I had a hat on." She stared at him. "It was a calculated risk," he said, with the particular tone of a man who has already had this argument with himself and lost. "I wasn't planning to stay in town. I didn't expect Pruitt to recognize the name. He only caught it when he looked at the ledger. By then, the bid was done." The beans were ready. She divided them into 2 tin cups and handed one to Mercer and held the other with both hands, warming her palms, looking out at the canyon where the shadows were retreating down the far wall as the sun climbed. "So we have to go back toward Dust Ridge," she said, "in daylight, on one horse, with a wanted man. I didn't say you had to go. You also didn't say I had a choice. You have a choice." He said it flatly, no drama in it. "The indenture document Pruitt gave you is unenforceable. I told you, the law it's based on doesn't exist in territorial statute. If you want to ride north and find a town that isn't in the trust's pocket and start over, you can do that." Eliza looked at him steadily. "And the case? Is mine to pursue or not pursue? With 17 pieces of evidence, 2 of which are weak, no supporting surveyor's plat, and 1 dead notary." He met her gaze. "Yes." She drank from the tin cup. The beans were still barely edible. She thought about what it meant to ride north and start over in a town she didn't know with no money and no one who knew her name. And she thought about the platform in Dust Ridge's square, and Pruitt's voice, and the way the crowd had watched her like she was something on a shelf they were deciding whether to buy. She thought about 17 documents that told the story of what the Land and Commerce Trust had done to people who couldn't fight back. People with names on the deeds. Amos Fitch, Calloway, Whitmore's widow still living in the town where the trust ran everything. "I'm not riding north," she said. Mercer nodded once. He didn't say thank you, and she didn't want him to. They broke camp with the methodical quiet of 2 people who'd already negotiated the important things and were now just dealing with logistics. She helped load the saddlebags. He kicked dirt over the fire ring until there was nothing left that could catch. The trail down from the shelf was as nerve-testing as the climb up had been, the roan picking his way down with careful displeasure, and she went ahead of him on foot while Mercer led the horse by the reins, neither of them speaking until they reached the bottom and the horse's hooves were on flat ground again. "We can't ride into Millhaven together," she said, "not with the notice outstanding." "Agreed. I'll camp about 5 miles out. You go into the land office alone." He reached into the saddlebag and produced a folded piece of paper. A hand-drawn map, clean lines, compass rose in the corner, with a route marked in pencil from a point labeled Canyon to a cross-marked point labeled MH. The land office is the 3rd building on the left from the north end of Main Street. It's run by a clerk named Sutter. He's lazy, and he's been there 12 years, which means the records are disorganized, but they're complete. He never throws anything out. She took the map. "What name do I use for the survey plat?" "Ask for the original plat survey of the Calloway homestead claim, filed approximately 1871, claimant Thomas Calloway. If Sutter asks why, tell him you're settling an estate. If he asks whose estate, tell him it's a private matter and you'd appreciate his discretion." "Will that work?" "Probably." Sutter responds well to the implication that there's something being done that he shouldn't ask too much about. Makes him feel trusted. She folded the map and put it in her pocket alongside the indenture contract that she was keeping, she'd decided. Not because it had any real legal force, but because she wanted documentation of everything that had happened to her in Dust Ridge, in the order it had happened. They rode most of the morning without significant conversation. The country changed as they moved. The open, broken scrub giving way to longer grass, more cottonwoods in the dry draws, the horizon widening. The heat built steadily. The roan moved with his usual ground-eating pragmatism, and Eliza had gotten more comfortable in the saddle, redistributing her weight in a way that stopped the worst of the ache. Around mid-morning, Mercer said, "Tell me about the documents again, the weak ones." She explained it clearly, the way she'd thought it through. The ink inconsistency on the Whitmore deed was explainable by a bad batch of ink or a different pen, both of which were common enough that a defense lawyer could muddy the water with them. The off-center seal was worse. Seal presses were expensive, and surveyors took care of them, and a perfectly calibrated press didn't produce off-center impressions unless something was wrong with the press, or the impression was made on a different document and transferred. "Transferred how?" Mercer asked. "Dampen paper over the original impression. You can transfer a wax seal if the wax is warm enough and you have the right kind of pressure and patience." She paused. "My father tried it once, poorly." A moment of quiet. Then Mercer said, "Your father forged documents?" "My father attempted to forge documents. There's a distinction. She looked straight ahead at the trail. He was not skilled at it. He was caught on the second attempt and paid a fine. It was before I was born. My mother told me about it as a lesson in what happens when you take shortcuts. Did it work as a lesson? It worked as a lesson in not getting caught. There was a pause, and then, she heard it clearly, despite how small it was, Cade Mercer laughed. Not a big laugh, not a comfortable one, more the involuntary kind that comes out before a person can decide whether they meant to let it. But real. She didn't look at him, but something in the set of her shoulders changed. They reached the point where he'd camp around early afternoon, a dry ravine with enough cottonwood cover to hide a horse and a man from the trail. He unloaded what she'd need, the two weakest documents, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, the map, and a small amount of money for any fees Sutter might charge. How long should it take? He asked. An hour in the office if Sutter cooperates. 2 if he doesn't, plus the ride. I'll be here. Don't wait for dark to head back. I don't want you on an unfamiliar trail at night. I've been on unfamiliar trails at night before. I know, he said. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him. He was holding the roan's reins, and the sun was coming down at an angle that made his shadow very long, and the off-center nose quite apparent, and there was a smear of dust on the left side of his jaw that he hadn't noticed. He looked, in that moment, less like the most feared man in the territory and more like someone who'd been doing a hard thing alone for a long time and was finding it strange that they weren't doing it alone anymore. She took the reins without ceremony and turned the horse toward the trail. Millhaven was a real town, which Dust Ridge was also technically, but the distinction felt meaningful when she rode in. Bigger, louder, more people who didn't know her face and had no reason to look twice at a woman in a faded gray dress asking for records at the land office. She tied the roan at the post outside the third building on the left from the north end of Main Street, smoothed her hair back, and went in. Sutter was exactly as described. A small, dusty man of somewhere between 45 and 60, with the particular resignation of someone who'd chosen a job for its stability and had long since stopped asking whether he liked it. The office smelled of old paper and something that might have been turpentine. Ledgers and filing boxes covered every surface with the organized disorder of a system only one person fully understood. I'm settling an estate, Eliza said before he'd finished looking up. I need the original plat survey of a homestead claim filed approximately 1871. Claimant Thomas Calloway. Sutter looked at her over the tops of his glasses. That would be in the pre-consolidation files. I understand. I'd appreciate your discretion regarding the estate matter. His expression shifted slightly. Not suspicion, more the particular alertness of a man who sensed he was being given permission not to ask questions, which was what he preferred anyway. He stood and went to the back of the office and began working through the boxes on the far shelf with the methodical patience of someone who knew where things were even when they didn't look like they did. It took him 35 minutes. He found it in the third box he opened, the original plat survey of the Calloway homestead claim, dated September 1871, signed by a territorial surveyor named Marcus Webb, stamped with the land office's original seal. Eliza looked at it carefully, comparing it mentally to the deed in her pocket. The boundaries were different, not drastically. You wouldn't catch it if you were reading quickly, but the northeast corner marker was off by 40 yards, and the creek boundary was drawn to include water access that the later deed had quietly eliminated. 40 yards. Water rights. In frontier land, those two things were the difference between a viable farm and a slow failure. She thanked Sutter and paid the $2 fee and rode back out of Millhaven without rushing, keeping to the same pace she'd come in at, and it wasn't until she was clear of the town and back on the trail south that she let herself breathe properly. Mercer was where she'd left him, sitting against a cottonwood with the cracked leather journal on his knee, writing. He looked up when he heard the horse. She dismounted and handed him the surveyed plat without preamble. He looked at it, traced the northeast corner marker with one finger, saw what she'd seen. 40 yards, he said, and the creek boundary. The forged deed eliminates the water access completely. She sat down on a nearby rock. Her back hurt, and her blister had gotten worse during the walk around Millhaven, and her dress had a new dust stain on the hem that was going to be nearly impossible to get out. The survey plat corroborates the original deed and directly contradicts the forged one. Webb's signature is authenticated on file. That document just got a lot stronger. Mercer looked at the plat for another moment, then at her. One down, he said. One down, she agreed. Now we need Clara Whitmore. The sun was dropping toward the west, and the shadows in the ravine were getting long. Somewhere in the cottonwoods above them, a bird was making an irritated sound about something. The horse cropped grass nearby with complete indifference to everything else. They had a document. They had a direction. They had 60 miles of Badlands between them and a man named Amos Fitch, who might still be willing to stand up and say what had been done to him. And they had a town behind them that had sold a woman on a fence-board platform and called it paperwork. It wasn't enough yet. Mercer knew it, and so did Eliza. The structure of what the trust had built was solid, and it had money and lawyers and a mayor behind it, and what they had was oilcloth envelopes and a survey plat from a dusty filing box and two people who, by any reasonable measure, had no business believing this was going to work. But the evening was clear and the plat was real, and the ink on it was true. And that was something to carry into tomorrow. Clara Whitmore lived in a narrow house on the east end of Dust Ridge's only residential street, a place that had once been painted white and was now the color of old chalk, with a porch that sagged on one side and a kitchen garden out back that was doing better than the house. She was somewhere in her late 50s, a compact woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back tight and the kind of face that had made a decision a long time ago to keep its own counsel. Getting to her was the problem. Dust Ridge was not a large town, but it was a town where people talked, and a woman riding in alone on a horse that had been seen leaving with Cade Mercer 2 days prior was exactly the kind of thing that got noticed. Eliza understood this. So she left the roan with Mercer at a camp in the broken country 3 miles west of town and walked in on foot, coming in from the south along the dry creek bed that ran behind the residential street, arriving at Clara Whitmore's back gate in the early morning while most of Dust Ridge was still at breakfast. She knocked at the back door. Clara Whitmore answered it with a dish towel in her hand and a look of complete unsurprise that suggested she'd either been expecting someone or had reached the age where surprise was no longer worth the energy. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eliza said, "my name is Eliza Hart. I was Clarence Hart's daughter." Clara looked at her for a moment. "I know who you are." She stepped back from the door. "Come in before someone sees you standing there." The kitchen was small and very clean, smelling of coffee and the particular sweetness of dried herbs hanging from a ceiling rack. Clara set the dish towel on the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether Eliza wanted any, which she did badly, having had nothing but water and cold beans since the night before. "I saw what they did to you," Clara said, sitting down at the kitchen table. She said it matter-of-factly, not with pity, which Eliza appreciated. "I watched from my window. I couldn't see the platform from here, but I heard Pruitt's voice going on." "I need to ask you about your husband's notary practice," Eliza said. She sat across from Clara and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Specifically about a document notarized in April of 1879, a deed transfer on the Whitmore homestead parcel, not your family, different Whitmores, originally belonging to a settler named Caleb Whitmore." Clara's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a small tightening around the eyes. "I worked every notarization my husband did for the last 15 years of his life," she said. "I handled the clerical record. Date, document type, parties present, fees paid. Everyone." "Do you remember the Caleb Whitmore deed?" A pause. Clara turned her coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, not drinking from it. "I remember it," she said carefully, "because the seal press jammed that afternoon. We'd been having trouble with it for a week. My husband was embarrassed about it, thought it made his office look unprofessional. He pressed the seal 3 times before he got an impression he was satisfied with." Eliza set down her cup. 3 times. The first 2 were off-center. He threw away those copies and made a clean one. The final notarized document had a properly centered seal because he wouldn't give Caleb Whitmore anything less, which meant the document in the trust's possession, the one Eliza and Mercer had, the one with the off-center seal, was not the final notarized copy. It was one of the 2 discarded attempts. Someone had retrieved a rejected copy from Walter Whitmore's waste bin, or from wherever he'd put them, and used it as though it were valid. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eliza said, "would you be willing to state that in front of a territorial judge?" Clara looked at her for a long time, long enough that a wagon went past on the street out front and a dog started barking somewhere and stopped. Walter spent 30 years building a reputation for honest work, she said finally. 30 years. And these men used his seal, his name, his press, on a forged document. She picked up her coffee cup. Yes, I'll state it. Eliza exhaled. I have to tell you something else. The man who's been gathering this evidence, his name is Cade Mercer. He's wanted in 3 counties on charges the trust manufactured. Claire's expression didn't waver. I know who Cade Mercer is. Walter represented him on a property matter 2 years ago. He paid his fee on time and he told the truth in deposition. She set her cup down. That's more than I can say for half the men in this town. Eliza walked back out through the kitchen garden and down the dry creek bed the way she'd come, moving faster now, with the particular forward momentum of someone who has gotten what they came for and wants to be somewhere else before the luck runs out. It ran out about a mile outside of town. She heard the horses before she saw them, 2 riders coming down the western trail at a trot, moving with the purposeful bearing of men who were looking for something specific. She stepped off the trail into the scrub and crouched behind a juniper, and they went past close enough that she could see the trust brand on one man's saddlebag, a stylized CT in a circle, burned into the leather. They weren't after her, not specifically, but they were moving in the direction of Mercer's camp, and they were moving like they had information. She cut cross-country through the scrub at a pace that her blister strongly objected to and that she ignored completely. She reached the camp in a shallow draw of cottonwoods to find Mercer already packing. Saddlebags in one hand, bedroll half rolled under his arm, moving with the economy of a man who'd broken camp in a hurry before. 2 riders? She said, coming into the clearing without slowing down. Trust brand, about a mile behind me on the western trail. I know. I saw them from the ridge 10 minutes ago. He handed her the saddlebags without ceremony. There's a third. He went south about 20 minutes ago, probably to cut off the creek bed route. She took the saddlebags and began loading them. How did they find the camp? I used this draw 3 weeks ago when I was scouting Dust Ridge the first time. Someone saw the horse and remembered. He cinched the bedroll with 2 quick motions. Did you get Whitmore? She'll testify. The seal was from a discarded copy. The press was jamming that day. She can prove the valid document had a centered seal. Mercer stopped moving for exactly 1 second. Then he took the saddlebags from her and slung them over the roan's back. Get on. What about the third rider to the south? He'll be at the creek crossing in about 15 minutes. We go north, cut east through the canyon system, and come out above Red Rock Mesa. It adds 3 hours, but it keeps us out of the open. He gave her the saddle again and mounted behind her, and they moved out of the draw at a fast walk that became a canter as soon as the ground opened up, and Eliza held the saddle horn with one hand and kept her weight balanced and didn't look back because looking back at this particular moment would not improve anything. The canyon system north of Dust Ridge was a labyrinth of red rock passages and dry washes that Mercer navigated with the confidence of someone who'd memorized it the hard way. They rode for 2 hours without stopping, the roan's hooves raising dust in the narrow passages, the canyon walls pressing close and then opening and then pressing close again. Twice Mercer held up a hand and they stopped and listened, and twice the sound he'd heard turned out to be wind moving through the rock rather than horses. The third time he held up his hand, it wasn't wind, voices. Below them and to the east, in the floor of the canyon, echoing off the walls in that strange, amplified way that made it impossible to judge distance accurately. At least 3 men, she thought. Maybe 4. Mercer turned the roan without a word, and they went back the way they'd come, taking a different fork that climbed steeply up a loose gravel slope. The horse lunged and scrambled, and she leaned forward over the saddle horn to shift weight, and they came out onto a narrow bench of rock 40 feet above the canyon floor and kept moving. They didn't speak until they were an hour past the canyon system, out onto higher ground where they could see in all directions. They know we're here, Eliza said. They know we're somewhere in this country. He scanned the terrain behind them. They don't have a specific position. There were at least 3 in the canyon. 4, I think. Pruitt doesn't do things small. He pulled up and let the horse breathe. The roan was blowing hard, sides heaving, but he was a strong animal and he recovered fast. Mercer handed the canteen back to Eliza. We can't go to Fitch directly. If they're following us north, we lead them straight to him. She drank and handed the canteen back. So we go to Fitch indirectly, which means time. Which means they'll have time to move against him first if they think he's a witness. She looked at the terrain, thinking, does Fitch know about the others? The other settlers the trust has taken land from? Some of them. He knows Calloway by name, doesn't know the others personally. If we can get word to Fitch without going to him ourselves, if there's someone who could carry a message north without being connected to us. Clara Whitmore, Mercer said. Eliza looked at him. She already knows the situation. She's in Dust Ridge, which is normal. She lives there. She moves around without drawing attention. If she's willing to carry a letter north to Fitch's property. I just asked her to testify against the most powerful men in this part of the territory. I'm not sure I can also ask her to carry messages through country where they've got riders out. You don't have to ask her, Mercer said. I'll ask her. She turned to look at him directly. It was the first time he'd offered to walk into proximity with Dust Ridge himself, and they both understood what that meant given the wanted notice. He met her look and didn't qualify it. She represented you before, Eliza said. Walter Whitmore. You said you respected his work. And I never thanked him for it properly. He died before I had the chance. He looked at the trail ahead. I'll go at night. Single rider. No fire. In and out before anyone's the wiser. It was a bad plan, and they both knew it. It was also the least bad available option, which was a category of plan they were getting increasingly familiar with. They made camp that night in a shallow depression on the high plain, no fire, eating cold from the saddlebags. The sky was enormous and full of stars, and there was a wind that had decided to be cold about it, despite it being August, cutting across the flat ground without obstruction and finding every gap in a duster. Eliza wrapped herself in the canvas bedroll and watched Mercer check his gun in the dark with the practiced hands of someone who didn't need light for it. He broke it, checked it, loaded it with the particular deliberate care of a man who understood exactly what he was carrying. How many men has the trust got? She asked. In the territory? Probably 15 riders on payroll, plus whatever local law they can lean on. Greer controls the Dust Ridge Marshal. Pruitt has a relationship with the county sheriff in Millhaven that I don't fully trust. He holstered the gun. The senior partner of the trust is a man named Victor Crane. He's based in the territory capital, and he doesn't come out to the frontier himself. He runs it through a local manager named Dowd, Coleman Dowd, who you won't have seen because he stays out of the public proceedings. Dowd makes the decisions Pruitt can't be trusted with. How do you know about Dowd? The ledger pages. His name appears as a counter-signatory on the internal transactions. And one of the settlers the trust came after. A woman named Ruth Calloway, Thomas Calloway's widow. She saw Dowd at her property the day they came to take it. Described him as tall, dark suit, very quiet. Never raised his voice, he paused. The quiet ones are usually worse. Eliza thought about that. Is Dowd in Dust Ridge now? I don't know. Another pause. That's what worries me. She lay back and looked at the stars. The wind moved through the grass around the depression with a low, continuous sound like something running very far away. She thought about Clara Whitmore in her chalk-white house with the sagging porch, perfectly calm, willing to stand up and say what she knew, because a man had used her dead husband's name on a lie. She thought about Amos Fitch 60 miles north with 2 kids and cattle that needed water from a creek the trust now controlled. She thought about the platform in Dust Ridge's square, and Pruitt's voice saying labor indenture as though that were a thing that existed. Mercer, she said. Yeah. When this is done, one way or the other, what happens to you? A long silence, longer than it needed to be. The wanted notices go away if the trust is dismantled, he said. The charges were manufactured. A territorial judge with the right documents in front of him can vacate them. That's what happens to the notices. I asked what happens to you. He didn't answer immediately. She could hear him shifting position against the saddlebag he was using as a pillow, settling. I don't know, he said finally. And from the way he said it, the same flatness he used for everything, but with something underneath it that was different from his usual controlled nothing. She understood that this was not evasion. He actually didn't know. He'd been moving toward this thing for 8 months and had not, apparently, given serious thought to what came after it, which was either focused or broken depending on how you chose to see it. She didn't say anything else. The stars turned overhead. The wind kept at it. Around the second hour of real dark, she heard Mercer get up and heard the soft, familiar sounds of a man saddling a horse in the dark. The quiet clink of the bit, the grunt and settle of the roan accepting the weight. She kept her eyes closed and her breathing even, because he hadn't told her he was going and she hadn't asked, and they had arrived at the particular kind of understanding where not everything needed to be stated aloud. He rode out at a walk, the sound of hooves on dry grass fading quickly to nothing. She lay in the dark and did the math she'd been doing for 3 days. 17 documents, now with the Calloway survey plat and the Whitmore testimony to corroborate 2 of the weakest ones. Amos Fitch's testimony pending, the letter to Judge Cross in Santa Caldera, which still hadn't been written, a senior trust partner named Victor Crane who hadn't appeared in any of their documents in a way that connected him directly enough, a manager named Dowd whose location she didn't know. It was close. It wasn't there yet. She rolled onto her side and pulled the canvas tighter and thought about something Mercer had said in a different context 2 days ago that had stayed with her. Most people don't have either of those things, meaning money or the capacity to argue. What they were building, these documents, these testimonies, this careful accumulation of proof, was exactly those things. Money and capacity, converted into a form that other people could stand behind. A structure that didn't depend on one person's word against another's. It needed to be enough. It needed to hold up in front of a judge who actually read what was placed before him. It needed to be clean and complete and corroborated 7 ways, because the trust would bring lawyers who were very good at finding the single thread to pull, and if one piece came apart, the rest would have to be strong enough to stand without it. She was still working through it when she heard the horse coming back 2 hours later, walking in at the same steady pace. She sat up. Mercer came into the depression and dismounted, and she could tell from the way he moved that nothing had gone wrong. He unsaddled the roan, staked him out, and sat down against the saddlebag again in the dark. "She'll go," he said quietly. "Leaves at first light. Knows a family north of here she can stay with 1 night each way. Gives her cover for the trip." Eliza let out a breath. "How was she?" "Angry," he said. "Not at us, just angry." He was quiet a moment. "She made me tea." Eliza almost said something and then didn't. "She also told me something I didn't know," he continued. "Dowd was in Dust Ridge 2 days ago. She saw him at the trust office, which is run out of the back of Pruitt's building. He left before the auction, but apparently came back." The wind moved across the high plain in a long, cold gust. "He's here," Eliza said. "He's here," Mercer confirmed. "Which means someone's told him there's a problem, which means they know what we have isn't just a wanted man with a grudge. They know about the documents." She absorbed this. "Then they know about the court case we're building. They know there's something to defend against. They don't know the shape of it yet." He shifted. "We need to move faster than I planned." The stars were still turning, and the grass was still running in the wind, and somewhere to the north, 60 miles away, Amos Fitch was sleeping on his 40 acres. Half of which had been taken from him, and his cattle were thirsty from water the trust had cut off, and a woman named Clara Whitmore was going to ride toward him at first light with a letter in her coat. The picture was assembling itself, piece by piece, in the dark. It was not a comfortable picture, but it was real, and it was theirs. And Coleman Dowd sitting in the back of Pruitt's building 2 days ago, knowing that something was coming for him, meant that it was real enough for powerful men to be worried about it. That, Eliza thought, was the first thing that had felt like progress in a long time. Clara Whitmore made it to Amos Fitch's property in 2 days and came back in 3, and the letter she carried north had done what it needed to do. Fitch sent his answer back with her, written on the inside of a flour sack because he didn't have paper. "I'll come. Tell me when and where." 4 words more than Mercer had expected. They spent the intervening days moving, because staying still had stopped being an option the moment Dowd arrived in Dust Ridge. They camped in a different place every night. 1 night in the canyon system, 1 night on the high plain, One night in an abandoned homestead cabin with no roof and a floor full of dead leaves, where the wind came through the missing walls and kept the fire from catching properly, and they ate cold again and said very little. The roan was holding up. They both had saddle sores. Eliza's blister had torn open and healed into a callus in the space of a week, which was the kind of adaptation that happened when you stopped having the option of rest. She had been writing during those days. Not the formal affidavit yet. That required the full set of documents in front of her and enough stillness to get the language exactly right, but the framework of it, the structure, laying out the chain of evidence in a sequence that would make sense to a judge who was coming to it without context. She worked in the cracked leather journal, which Mercer had handed over to her without being asked, and she wrote in the small, precise hand she'd learned doing survey work with her father, fitting a great deal onto every page. Mercer watched her do this sometimes, from across whatever fire they had, and she noticed him watching, and neither of them mentioned it. The plan they'd settled on was not elegant. Mercer had used that word himself. Not elegant, in the flat tone he reserved for things he'd accepted as necessary. They would come into Dust Ridge openly, not sneaking in through creek beds or back gates, but riding in on the main road in the middle of the afternoon when the square was busy. They would go directly to the trust's office, the back of Pruitt's building, and Mercer would present what they had to whatever assembled witness could be gathered on short notice. The affidavit needed to be read in a public space, with people present, because a document presented privately to a corrupt official in a back room could be made to disappear, and no one would ever know it had existed. Public record. That was what they needed. Not a courtroom yet. They couldn't get to Santa Caldera without more time than they had, but a public statement of the evidence, witnessed by enough people of enough different backgrounds that burying it would require silencing all of them. Pruitt will object, Eliza said, on the morning of the third day after Clara's return. Yes. Dowd will have men there. Probably. And the marshal works for Greer, who works for the trust. Also yes. He looked at her across the dead fire they hadn't bothered to restart, because they were leaving within the hour, and the wood was wet anyway. You see a better way to do this? She had been thinking about nothing else for 3 days. No, she said. But I want Fitch there. His testimony isn't just corroborating evidence. He's a name with a face. He's a man the town knows, or knows of. He had land, and they took it from him. That's a story people can hold on to. 17 documents are hard to understand. One man standing up and saying this happened to me and here is the proof is not. Mercer was quiet a moment. He's coming. Clara said he'd leave his property the same day she got back to Dust Ridge. If he rides hard, he'll be in the territory by tomorrow morning. Then we wait one more day. He didn't argue. Fitch arrived the next morning at the abandoned homestead, having somehow found them from the rough map directions in Clara's letter, which said something about the man's capability. He was smaller than Eliza had imagined from the documents. Compact, sun-worn, maybe 50 years old, with a gray beard he'd apparently given up trimming at some point and hands that were square and scarred from years of fence work and rock clearing. He rode a bay mare that was considerably worse than the roan, and he dismounted with the slightly stiff gait of a man who'd pushed himself harder than his body wanted. He looked at Mercer. You look the same. You look worse, Mercer said. They cut the water in June. 50 cattle. He said it without self-pity, just the flat inventory of a man accounting for damage. Lost 31. Sold the rest to keep the family fed. He turned to Eliza. Your heart's daughter. Yes. I heard what they did to you in the square. His jaw moved. My wife cried for 2 days. Eliza didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to give one. They spent that evening going through everything. All 17 documents spread out on the floor of the roofless cabin, with Fitch sitting cross-legged among them, and Eliza reading him the relevant passages and explaining the chain of evidence in the careful, layered way she'd been rehearsing in her head. Fitch listened without interrupting, which was a quality she respected in a person. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise and relevant. When she was done, he sat for a moment looking at the documents around him, and then he said, That's my name. Right there on the first deed. And on the second one, my name is wrong, Saul. It's spelled wrong. Amos Fitch has 2 T's in Fitch. That one has 1. Eliza looked at the document. She had read it many times, and she had missed it. They misspelled it, she said. Because nobody who knew me wrote that deed, Fitch said. Everybody who knew me knew my name. Mercer picked up the document and held it toward the failing light from the gap in the wall where the window had been. Fitch, 1 T. Fitch, 2 T's. Amos Fitch tapped the document with one thick finger. That's 17 pieces of evidence and a spelling mistake. I think even Pruitt's lawyers are going to have a hard time with a spelling mistake. It was so mundane that it took a moment for the weight of it to land. Then Eliza laughed, a real one, not polite, a short, startled laugh that surprised her more than it surprised anyone else, and Mercer looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was something in the same county. The approach to Dust Ridge the following afternoon was the most uncomfortable 3 hours Eliza could remember, which was saying something given the week she'd had. The three of them rode in together, Eliza on the roan, Mercer on Fitch's bay mare, because the roan was faster, and if things went wrong fast was what Eliza was going to need, and Fitch on a horse he'd borrowed from a farm 2 miles out that was elderly and philosophical about the whole situation. Mercer had the wanted notice in his pocket. He'd folded it and put it there deliberately, which she'd watched him do and hadn't commented on. If the marshal came at him, he would produce it himself and hand it over rather than be handled, which was either a dignity position or a tactical one or both. They came in from the north on the main road and didn't slow when they hit the edge of town. The first person who saw them was a boy outside the livery, who stared and then ran inside. By the time they reached the square, there were already people stepping out of storefronts to look. Eliza knew what they were seeing. She tried to see it from outside. A wanted man riding openly down Dust Ridge's main street in the middle of the afternoon, a woman who'd been auctioned off a week ago beside him, and Amos Fitch, who some of these people had known for 20 years, on a borrowed horse with 20 years of frontier on his face. "Pruitt's office," Mercer said, and they turned. Doyle Pruitt was not in his office. The front door was locked. Through the window, Eliza could see papers on the desk and a hat on the hook and a coffee cup still sitting out, which meant he'd left recently. "He knows we're here," Mercer said. "Give him 5 minutes," Fitch said. "Either he comes out or something else happens." Something else happened. Not in 5 minutes, but in 2, from the direction of the marshal's office down the block. 3 men coming out, one of them wearing the badge and 2 of them not, all 3 of them moving with the deliberate, unhurried walk of men who'd been told to convey authority rather than haste. Behind them, from the trust's office entrance at the side of Pruitt's building, came 2 more men. Not Pruitt. Not Dowd, as far as Eliza could tell. Hired men. The same category as the riders she'd seen on the Western Trail a week ago. The square was gathering. Not a crowd yet, but people stopping on the edges, watching. Mercer dismounted. He turned to face the approaching marshal, a thick-necked man named Burl Ames, who Eliza had seen around town before the auction and had registered as someone who held his authority the way insecure people held borrowed tools. And he waited. "Mercer," Ames said, stopping 10 feet away, "you're wanted on outstanding warrants in 3 counties. I'm placing you under arrest." "In a minute," Mercer said. He reached into the inside pocket of his duster and produced the oilcloth bundle, not the gun, the documents, and held it up. "I want to present evidence first." Ames blinked. This was clearly not the response he'd been briefed for. "I said, I heard you. I'll go with you when we're done here. I am not resisting arrest." Mercer's voice was patient in the particular way of a man who had no patience left, but was performing it because it served a purpose. "I'm asking for 5 minutes in this square to present evidence of crimes committed against the citizens of this territory. That's all." The 2 trust men had stopped about 20 feet back. The crowd on the edges had grown, maybe 40 people now, more coming. Eliza recognized a few of them, the woman who'd turned away at the auction, the boy from the fence, a couple of men from the general store, Clara Whitmore standing near the harness shop, very still, watching. Ames looked at the crowd, looked back at Mercer, made the calculation of a man who understood that how he handled the next 30 seconds was going to be the story people told about him for a long time. 5 minutes, he said. "Then you come with me." Eliza moved. She hadn't discussed this with Mercer specifically. They'd discussed the general shape of it, the public reading, the witnesses, But she understood that her voice in this was different from his. He was wanted. He was feared. He was everything the trust could use to make this look like a criminal act rather than an exposure of one. She stepped forward, and she was the one who spoke. "My name is Eliza Hart," she said, loud enough to carry to the edges of the square. "Most of you know that name. A week ago I stood on a platform in this square, while a man named Doyle Pruitt auctioned me off to settle a debt my father owed the Land and Commerce Trust." She paused. "I want to tell you what the trust actually is." She read from the affidavit she'd written in the cracked leather journal, which she held open in both hands. She read it clearly, in the same flat, precise voice her father had taught her to use when reading land documents. No performance, no dramatics, just the facts in the order they appeared, each one leading to the next. The forged deed on the Callaway parcel and what the original survey plat showed, the Whitmore notarization and what Clara had seen that day with the jamming press. The ledger entries with Greer's name and the council members, the letter from Greer to the trust's senior partner, which she quoted verbatim because the language was so explicit it needed no interpretation. She stopped at one point because her voice was starting to do something she didn't want it to do. Swallowed, continued. When she got to the Fitch parcel, Amos Fitch stepped forward. He didn't say much. He said his name, spelled correctly. The 40 acres he'd had, the 20 they'd taken, the water rights, 50 cattle and 31 dead. He held up the forged deed and pointed to the misspelling. He set it down next to the legitimate deed and let people look. The square was very quiet. From the side entrance of Pruitt's building came a voice. "This is illegal interference with lawful commerce." Pruitt had emerged finally, standing in the doorway of his own building with a hand on the doorframe and the other hand gripping the ledger he apparently carried everywhere. His face was the color of old wax. "These are manufactured accusations from a wanted criminal and a woman under indenture, and—" "There is no indenture," Eliza said. She held up the contract Pruitt had given her and read the statutory citation it relied on. "The Labor Provision Act of March 3rd of this year. I went to the Territorial Records Office in Millhaven." She had not in fact done this, but Mercer had, and she had his notes. "That statute does not appear in the Territorial Ledger. It was not filed, recorded, or ratified. It doesn't exist." Pruitt's mouth opened. "The document you gave me," she said, "is a fabrication. Same as the deeds. Same as the notarization." Something moved through the crowd. Not a sound exactly, more a shift, a collective adjustment of posture, the particular way a group of people changes when it realizes it has been looking at something wrong and is now looking at it right. The trust's 2 hired men had moved closer during the reading. One of them had his hand near his gun. Mercer was watching him with the still focused attention of a man who had already made every relevant decision and was waiting for the situation to catch up with him. It was Burl Ames, of all people, who stopped it. The marshal turned to the trust man with his hand near his gun and said, "Take your hand away from that." His voice was different from the one he'd used with Mercer, harder, cleaner, with something in it that sounded less like borrowed authority and more like a man deciding what he actually stood for. "Both of you stay where you are." The hired man looked at Ames for a long moment. Then he moved his hand. The second trust man was looking at something over Eliza's shoulder. She turned. Coleman Dowd was in the square. She knew him immediately from Mercer's description, tall, dark suit, standing very still near the south entrance. And he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man performing calculation, assessing whether the situation was recoverable. It was the expression of someone who has not yet lost, but is beginning to understand that losing is possible. He turned and walked back out of the square. Ames saw it, Mercer saw it, Eliza saw it. "Marshal," Mercer said, "Coleman Dowd, he just walked south." Ames stood for a moment that stretched. He had 5 minutes ago been preparing to arrest a wanted man on behalf of a town government that was, as of roughly the last 15 minutes, demonstrably corrupt. He was standing in a square full of people who had just heard everything. His next move was going to define what kind of man he was in this territory for the rest of his life. He turned to one of his 2 deputies and said, "Go after him." Then to the other, "Pruitt, bring him in." Pruitt made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and stepped back into his doorway, and the deputy followed him in. What came after was not clean. It was not swift. There was a great deal of confusion in the square. People talking, the crowd pressing forward, two of the trust men arguing loudly with Ames about jurisdiction, while Mercer stood 10 feet away being technically under arrest and not going anywhere. One of the hired men tried to leave on horseback and made it half a block before Fitch, of all people, calmly reached out and caught the horse's bridle and held it with the simple physical certainty of a man who'd been handling livestock for 30 years. Eliza stood in the middle of it with the affidavit still open in her hands, and she thought about what she needed to do next. The documents needed to go to Judge Cross in Santa Caldera. That meant a writer, tonight, with a full copy and a covering letter explaining the public presentation and naming every witness who'd been in the square. The letter to Cross needed to be in her hand, not Mercer's. She understood that, even if he didn't, because Mercer's name on a letter was something a clever lawyer could use against the contents. She closed the journal and walked to where Clara Whitmore was standing. "I need paper," she said, "and I need a writer who isn't connected to any of this." Clara looked at her steadily. "My nephew is 17 and he can write all night if you ask him properly." "Will he?" Clara's expression was the closest thing to dry humor Eliza had seen from her. "I'll ask him improperly. It'll work faster." Dowd was caught 2 miles south of Dust Ridge, on the road toward the territorial capital, by Ames's deputy, a younger man named Coles who was apparently faster on a horse than anyone had expected. He came back into town with Dowd in front of him, and Dowd came without resistance, which told Eliza something about the man. He'd made his calculation and concluded that running was worse than being brought in, which meant he already had a plan for what happened once lawyers were involved. That was its own kind of problem, but it was a problem for Santa Caldera and Judge Cross, not for the square in Dust Ridge at 4 in the afternoon. Mercer submitted to Ames's arrest without incident. He handed over his gun and held out his wrists and said nothing. Eliza watched him do it from across the square and felt something cold settle in her chest that she addressed by being practical about it. The warrant was manufactured. Cross would vacate it. It was a night in the Dust Ridge jail, which was unpleasant, not a death sentence. She finished writing the covering letter in Clara Whitmore's kitchen at the same table where she'd had coffee 4 days ago. Clara's nephew, a lanky boy named Ed who had his aunt's same quality of unsurprise about difficult situations, took the full copy of the documents, the letter, and directions to Santa Caldera's courthouse, and he left before sunset. Eliza sat at Clara's table after he left and looked at her own hands on the table in front of her, ink stained from the writing, a little unsteady, the callus on her left heel pulling slightly where she'd been on her feet too long, and she thought, it's in someone else's hands now. She had spent a week building something out of paper and testimony, and old survey maps, and the memory of a dead notary's press jamming on a Tuesday afternoon, and now it was on its way to a judge who actually read things, and either it would be enough or it wouldn't, and there was nothing more to do about it tonight. "Stay here," Clara said from the stove where she was making something with actual vegetables in it. "There's a back room. It has a real bed." Eliza looked up. "You look like you've been sleeping on rock," Clara said matter-of-factly. She had been sleeping on rock. "Thank you," she said. The bed in Clara's back room was a narrow iron frame thing with a mattress that was lumpy in 3 specific places, and it was the most comfortable thing Eliza Hart had lain on in 10 days. She was asleep within 5 minutes of lying down, and she did not dream. And the night passed over Dust Ridge with its cargo of locked doors and cooling fires and 2 men in the jail and 1 boy riding hard towards Santa Caldera with a courier bag across his chest. And the square that had held an auction a week ago sat empty in the dark, its fence-board platform still standing, slowly losing its reason for being there. Judge Harlan Cross arrived in Dust Ridge 11 days after Ed Whitmore rode out of town with the courier bag across his chest. He came with 2 territorial marshals and a court recorder and no announcement, which was apparently how he preferred to operate, the way a man who'd been on the bench 11 years and turned down 2 promotions tends to operate, with the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped needing to signal his authority before he uses it. He set up in the largest room of Dust Ridge's only hotel, which wasn't large, and he began reviewing documents the same afternoon he arrived, with his coat on the chair and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a pair of reading spectacles that he took off and put back on with the regularity of someone conducting a private argument with his own eyesight. Eliza was called in on the second morning. She had been staying at Clara Whitmore's house, sleeping in the lumpy iron frame bed and eating actual cooked food for the first time in 2 weeks, and she had spent the intervening 11 days doing two things: writing the formal affidavit in its final version, clean and complete, language chosen for precision rather than persuasion, and waiting. The waiting was harder than the writing. She had said everything there was to say in the square that afternoon, and now the situation had moved into a room she couldn't fully control, and she was doing what she always did when she couldn't control something, working on the parts she could and trying not to think too much about the rest. Mercer had been released from the Dust Ridge jail on the fourth day after Ames had sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office in the capital and received confirmation that the warrants against him were under formal review pending the court proceedings. He was not cleared, not yet, but he was out, which meant he was in town, which meant she saw him at Clara's table the morning of the fifth day when she came into the kitchen and found him sitting there with a cup of coffee and the cracked leather journal open in front of him, going through his own notes with the focused expression of a man preparing for something. He looked up when she came in. "Cross is thorough," he said. "Ed said he read every document twice on the ride in." "Ed talked to him on the ride?" "Rode alongside the carriage for about 20 miles. The judge apparently asked him questions about the territory." Eliza sat down and poured her own coffee. "What kind of questions?" "How long families had been out here. What the land was worth. Whether people had options if something went wrong." Mercer turned a page. "Ed told him there weren't many options, and the judge wrote something down." She looked at him across the table. He looked different from the man she'd first seen in the gap between the harness shop and the assay office. Not softer, not easier, but less contained. Like something that had been held under pressure for a long time had been released enough to breathe. He still had the off-center nose and the controlled eyes, but the control felt less like armor and more like habit, the kind of habit you could choose to set down if you decided to. She hadn't told him that she'd noticed. She wasn't sure she needed to. Cross interviewed her for 2.5 hours. He asked about every document in sequence, asked her to explain how she'd identified the problems with the Whitmore deed, asked her to walk him through the Callaway survey comparison, asked 3 separate questions about the internal trust ledger and the notation system. Not because he didn't understand it, she realized, but because he was making sure she did. He was testing whether she'd copied someone else's conclusions or arrived at her own. She answered everything directly and didn't elaborate beyond what was asked, which she could tell was the right approach because his expression didn't change when she did it. And judges who've been on the bench 11 years have a particular way of not changing their expression when they're satisfied. At the end, he took his spectacles off and looked at her plainly. "You wrote this affidavit yourself?" "Yes." "Your father was a surveyor." "Briefly, before other occupations." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. "The chain of evidence is well constructed, Miss Hart. The Whitmore corroboration in particular is thorough." "Clara Whitmore was thorough," Eliza said. "I just wrote down what she told me." Cross put his spectacles back on and made a note, and she understood the interview was over. What followed was not a trial. Cross had the authority to conduct a preliminary hearing under territorial law, and what he found in the preliminary hearing was sufficient, his word, spoken aloud in the hotel room on the 8th morning, to warrant immediate injunctive relief pending full proceedings in the territorial court, which meant, in plain language, the trust's land transfers were frozen. The deeds they held were suspended. No further evictions, no further debt proceedings, no further auctions. The Labor Provision Act, which had never existed in any legally valid form, was formally voided and a notation was sent to the Territorial Records Office in Millhaven. Pruitt was taken into territorial custody. Dowd, who had been held by Ames pending Cross's arrival, was transferred to the territorial marshals on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of official process. The warrant for Mercer was vacated on the same morning in writing, with a notation that the charges had been manufactured in retaliation for his investigative activities, which was a dry legal phrase that Eliza thought did not fully cover what had actually happened, but was more than she'd expected to see in official language. Mayor Aldous Greer resigned before he could be formally charged. He left town on a Thursday morning with a single bag and without telling anyone where he was going, which was, in Eliza's view, a form of confession. The trust's senior partner, Victor Crane, never came to Dust Ridge. He dealt with it from the territorial capital through lawyers, which was consistent with a man who'd built an empire at a distance and preferred to keep the distance intact even while it collapsed. The lawyers negotiated a settlement under which Crane avoided criminal charges in exchange for full financial restitution to every settler whose land had been taken or whose operations had been damaged by the trust's practices. It was the kind of outcome that felt insufficient, if you thought about it in terms of justice, and adequate if you thought about it in terms of what actually gets accomplished when powerful men have good legal representation. Eliza thought about it both ways at different times and accepted it both ways, which was something she'd learned from her father without him meaning to teach her, that what you can get is rarely exactly what you deserve to have, and you do better spending your energy on the former than mourning the latter. Amos Fitch got his water rights back. The territorial court, in its preliminary findings, specifically restored the water access that the trust had cut in June, and a territorial marshal rode out to Fitch's property with the paperwork and a letter of formal recognition that made no mention of the 31 cattle that had already died, but that established clearly enough that no one was going to touch what was left. Fitch came back to Dust Ridge one more time, about 3 weeks after Cross left. He came to return the borrowed horse and to sign some documents at the land office, and he stopped in at Clara Whitmore's kitchen, which had become, in some unofficial way, the place where the relevant people in this story ended up when they needed to sit down and drink something. He sat at Clara's table across from Eliza and said, "My wife wants you to come visit." Eliza looked up from the document she was reading. She had started helping Clara with some of the legal paperwork that had accumulated in the wake of Cross's preliminary findings, because there was a great deal of it, and someone had to be able to read it accurately. "That's very kind." "It's not kindness," Fitch said. "She wants to meet you. There's a difference." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She says a person should know who saved something for them." "I didn't save anything," Eliza said. "The documents did. The documents were in a box until you wrote them down in the right order." He looked at her steadily. "Don't be modest about it. It doesn't suit you." She laughed, the same short, startled kind as in the roofless cabin. "Fair point." He left after an hour, riding north on the returned horse with the papers in his bag, and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who had more work to do than he could finish and intended to do it anyway. The fence-board platform in the square came down on a Saturday, 11 days after Cross's arrival. It was not an organized effort. No one declared it or announced it. A man named Teague, who ran the lumberyard, simply walked out one morning with a pry bar and started on it, and 2 other men joined him, and by mid-morning there was a pile of boards where the platform had been, and by evening someone had loaded them onto a wagon and hauled them off, and the square was just a square again, which it had been before, and which it should always have been. Eliza watched it happen from the window of what had formerly been Pruitt's office. She was renting it now, the front half where the public business had been conducted, as distinct from the trust's operation in the back half, which was sealed pending the territorial court proceedings. The landlord was a man named Birch, who owned the building outright and who had rented to Pruitt under an arrangement he now described as insufficiently examined, which was the kind of thing people said in Dust Ridge when they wanted to indicate they'd made a bad choice, without fully admitting they'd had a choice. She had 2 filing boxes of land documents on the desk and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "Land Records. Consultation by appointment," which was not exactly a legal practice, but was not exactly not one either. There was no shortage of settlers in the territory who needed someone who could read documents accurately and tell them what they actually said, and there was no shortage of documents that needed reading in the aftermath of what the trust had done. And she charged a modest fee that most people could manage if they planned for it, and she was building something piece by piece, the same way she'd built the affidavit, in the order that made sense without skipping steps, accepting that it would take as long as it took. Mercer came by the office on a Tuesday in late September, about 6 weeks after Cross had come and gone. He knocked on the doorframe rather than just walking in, which was something he'd started doing and which she'd noticed without commenting on. "Going north," he said. She looked up from the document she was reading. A deed for a parcel near Red Rock that had 3 separate issues with the boundary description, none of which were the trust's doing, just ordinary bad surveying from 1874. "For how long?" "Don't know exactly." He leaned against the door frame with his hat in his hand, turning it slowly. I want to check on Fitch, and there are two other properties north of his that the trust had interests in. I want to make sure the settlements are actually being honored. They're legally bound to honor them. Legally bound means something when someone's checking. He paused. Crane's lawyers are good, the kind of good that finds compliance gaps. She set the deed down. You'll be back. It wasn't quite a question. He heard the difference. I'll be back, he said. She looked at him standing in the doorframe of the office that used to belong to the man who'd put her on a platform in the square, and she thought about the first time she'd seen him. The shadow by the harness shop, the controlled eyes, the voice that made 60 people go quiet without being loud. She thought about a week of cold camps and bad food and canyon walls, pressing clothes, and a roan horse that was somewhere out back right now, probably eating perfectly adequate grass without any particular opinion about what had happened to the humans around him. She thought about what it meant that he'd said, "I'll be back," without her asking. That was a thing he had chosen to say, and Cade Mercer did not say things he hadn't chosen. Take the roan, she said. He's faster, and you'll need fast if Crane's lawyers are playing compliance gaps. He was quiet for a moment. The roan's yours. The roan's been yours since before I met him. I'm using the chestnut mare that Ames's deputy found wandering near the canyon system last month. She went back to the deed. She's slower, but she's steady, and she doesn't object to the creek crossings. She heard him put his hat back on. The particular sound of it, the small adjustment, the two-finger settle at the brim, was specific enough that she would have known it in the dark. 2 weeks, he said, maybe 3. Take what you need. He left. She heard the roan moving out of the lot behind the building a few minutes later, the big ground-eating stride going north on the main road, and then the sound fading the way sounds did out in the open country, quickly, without ceremony. She went back to the deed and the bad surveying from 1874. There's something worth saying about what happened in Dust Ridge that August, and it's not the thing that sounds the most dramatic from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a story about a dangerous man and a brave woman and some documents and a corrupt institution brought to justice, which is all true, but which misses the actual thing, the thing that doesn't make it into the legal findings or the territorial court record. The actual thing is this. The trust didn't fall because Cade Mercer was feared or because Eliza Hart was brave. Those things helped, but they weren't the structure. The structure was 17 pieces of paper and a spelling mistake, and a dead man's jamming seal press, and a woman named Clara who remembered the exact date, and an old surveyor named Marcus Webb, who drew accurate lines in 1871, and a man named Amos Fitch who knew how to spell his own name. The trust fell because of accumulation, because enough small true things were put in the right order and held in place long enough for someone with the authority to act on them to read them carefully. That's not a story about heroes, it's a story about patience and precision, and the specific, unglamorous work of making evidence out of the things that are actually true. Eliza understood this, and it was why she rented the office and put the sign in the window and spent her days reading documents that most people found incomprehensible and found the thing in them that was either true or wasn't. It wasn't what she'd planned for her life. She hadn't, if she was honest, planned much for her life beyond getting clear of the debt that had killed her father's reputation and then hers. But it was work she was good at, and it was work that mattered to people who needed it done. And she had decided a long time ago, watching her father be other things, that those two qualities together were rare enough to be worth holding on to. Mercer came back in 3 weeks, as he'd said. Fitch's settlement was being honored. One of the other properties north had a compliance gap exactly as he'd predicted, and he'd found it and documented it and sent the documentation to the Territorial Court's Oversight Office in the capital, which was apparently a thing that existed and that Cross had told him about before leaving. He came into the office on a Wednesday evening when she was finishing up, and he had the cracked leather journal in his hand. He'd left it with her, and she'd been using it for ongoing case notes, and she'd half expected him to ask for it back. He didn't ask for it back. He set a new journal on the desk instead, same size, clean pages, with a note tucked inside the front cover in his careful handwriting, for the next set of things that need to be in the right order. She looked at it, then at him. "Did you eat?" she asked. "Not since this morning. Clara made soup. She always makes too much." She closed the old journal and put it in the desk drawer and stood up. Come on. They walked to Clara Whitmore's house through the cooling September evening, through the square where the platform wasn't anymore, past the harness shop where a shadow had stood 6 weeks ago and changed the shape of what the day was going to be. The town was ordinary around them in the way that towns become ordinary again after something extraordinary, which is quickly and completely and with a kind of collective determination to get back to normal that is both human and a little strange. Some things didn't go back. The families whose land was restored didn't go back to what they'd been before. You don't recover a lost season, a dead animal, a year of fear, and come out the same on the other side. Fitch's 31 cattle were still dead. Walter Whitmore was still dead. Clarence Hart was still dead, and Eliza still had his debt in her memory even though the paper was voided, because some debts are recorded somewhere you can't file a document against. And some things were just different now. Burl Ames had become, in the weeks since Cross's visit, a different kind of marshal than he'd been before. Not dramatically reformed, not a story of transformation, just a man who'd made one correct decision in a hard moment and who now had to keep making decisions that were consistent with it, which was its own kind of pressure. He was managing it imperfectly, the way people manage things they weren't entirely prepared for. Clara had soup on the stove and bread from that morning, and she set 2 more places at her table without being asked, because she'd reached the point where she simply expected them, which was a thing that had happened gradually and that no one had announced. She talked about the land office while they ate. There was a young man named Pritchett who'd taken Sutter's position in Mill Haven after Sutter retired, and Pritchett was apparently reorganizing the filing system with a thoroughness that Clara approved of and that would eventually make Eliza's work considerably easier. Mercer ate and listened and said a few things when they were relevant and didn't perform an interest he didn't have, which was something Eliza had come to appreciate about him the way you appreciate structural elements in a building. The more you understand what's holding things up, the more you value it. After dinner, she walked back to the office to lock up, and he walked with her, and they stood outside the door in the early dark while the town settled around them into its night sounds. "The next property," he said, "about 40 miles southeast. Woman named Ruth Calloway, Thomas Calloway's widow. The trust got the Calloway land through a forged appraisal as well as the forged deed. The appraisal is a separate chain of fraud, and I don't think Cross's proceedings covered it specifically." Eliza thought about that. She'd need to file separately. She'd need someone to help her file separately. She looked at him in the dark, the off-center nose, the hat at its particular angle. A man who'd spent 8 months alone building a case for people he barely knew, who'd walked into a public auction and spent $450 on a problem that wasn't strictly his, who had come back from the north in 3 weeks because he'd said he would, and he did what he said. 40 miles southeast, she said. 2 days' ride. I have a case I need to finish first. Probably 4 more days. Then 4 more days, he said simply, as though that were the most natural thing to settle, which it was. She unlocked the office and relocked it from outside and pocketed the key. The street was quiet. Somewhere a door closed. This was not the ending that got written about in the way people wrote about frontier stories. The clean resolution, the triumphant moment, the clear before and after. This was the actual ending, which looked like 2 people standing outside an office in a small town at night, talking about the next thing that needed doing. That was all. That was everything. What Eliza had learned in the 6 weeks between a platform in August and a Wednesday evening in late September was something she suspected she'd always known, but had never had occasion to test this directly. That the people who actually change things rarely do it in a single dramatic moment. They do it in the accumulation of small, precise actions, each one building on the last, each one requiring more endurance than brilliance. The dramatic moment, the square, the reading, the crowd going quiet, that was real. But it was only possible because of 17 documents and a dead man's press, and 3 weeks of writing and one boy who would write all night if you asked him properly. The world doesn't yield to heroes. It yields slowly, grudgingly, incompletely, to people who keep doing the next right thing even when they're tired and saddle sore and eating cold beans in a cabin with no roof, who understand that what they're building doesn't belong to them personally, but to everyone who needed it built. Eliza Hart had been sold on a platform in front of 60 people, and she had walked off that platform, and she had never stopped walking. Not from stubbornness, not from some extraordinary quality of character, but because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was just another thing she didn't know how to do. Cade Mercer had spent 8 months being the most feared man in the territory in the service of the most unglamorous work imaginable. Reading documents, cross-referencing deeds, riding back and forth across Badlands to talk to people who were scared and tired and not sure trusting him was a good idea. He had not saved anyone through violence, in the end. He had saved them through evidence, which was not what his reputation would have suggested and which he seemed quietly fine with. They were both, in their different ways, people who had been failed by the structures that were supposed to hold, fathers who left debts, towns that looked away, laws that turned out not to exist, and who had decided, independently and then together, that the correct response to that was to build something better, not to replace the structures with other structures, not to put different powerful people where powerful people had been, but to do the specific work of making truth visible enough that it couldn't easily be buried. It was not finished. Ruth Calloway was 40 miles southeast with an appraisal fraud that hadn't been addressed yet. There were other properties, other names, other small true things that needed to be put in the right order. The territorial court would move slowly, as courts do. Crane's lawyers would find gaps when they could. Burl Ames would make some good decisions and some bad ones. The land would stay difficult, and the weather would stay indifferent, and the work would stay hard. But the platform was gone from the square. The deeds were being corrected. Amos Fitch's cattle could drink, and in a narrow office on the main street of Dust Ridge, with a new journal on the desk and an old one in the drawer full of things already accomplished, a woman who had been treated as property had built herself something that belonged entirely to her. Not given, not granted, not luck, but made, the way all real things are made, out of the materials available and the refusal to quit. That was enough to go on. That was, in the end, more than enough.